I was recommended this video by Ramsey Dewey and his take on modern Pankration, and I figured I'd make a reaction style video similar to the one I did for Sensei Seth. So if you're new to the channel, my name is Athanasios Bonas. I've been published in the International Journal of the History of Sport for what is the only article that focuses on Pankration's techniques ever to be published in a peer-reviewed journal. Without further ado, let's get to the video.
But we're talking about pankration in the ancient Greek Olympics. They had three combat sports: boxing, wrestling, and pankration. However you say that in ancient Greek, I have no idea.
It's pronounced Pankration. It's supposed to be 4 syllables.
Which meant all skill or all power.
It meant neither all skill nor all power. I go into this in the Sensei Seth video. It's all mastering, as in mastering the different types of combat: punching, kicking, groundwork, wrestling.
They had a striking sport, boxing, and a grappling sport, wrestling, which were notably different than their modern-day equivalents. Boxing, for example, the only rule was that you had to strike with the fist.
So boxing certainly had more rules than just that. Now, of course, it's unclear what rules existed, but I do have an article that is currently in the second round of peer reviews, which is likely going to be published soon, that goes into the hand strike techniques of boxing and Pankration, and I also touch upon the rules of each sport. Now, mind you, for example, the Brophies argued that in ancient Greek boxing, strikes to the body were illegal. I go into this in the article where I disprove this notion for several reasons, but it does appear that the rules of ancient Greek boxing developed as time went by. So, for example, when the boxing quote-unquote gloves were the imantes, which were leather straps that were used to tie the hand and the knuckles, it appears that base knuckle strikes to the head were not allowed. Then later, when we had the sfere, which had fleece padding around the knuckles, base knuckle strikes to the head were allowed, and we see an evolution of the guard and of the techniques that were used. So it's not as simple as the only rule was you only had to strike with the closed fist.
Although some historians suggest that ancient Greek boxing may have actually been kickboxing, so we don't really know.
There are two primary sources that prove this to be wrong. The first is literary, the second is an archaeological finding. So the first is The Idols by Theocritus. In this literary work, we have the hero Polydeuces, is one of the Gemini, who is also known as Pollux, engaged with a villain named Amycus. And prior to the fight, Polydeuces asks Amycus what are going to be the rules of engagement. In particular, in ancient Greek, he asks, Pygmachos ike posíthenon skelos, which literally translates to boxing or also strikes with the feet to the legs. In other words, he differentiates boxing with kicking. We know this because pygmachos, the word here, was used particularly for boxing, even as far back as Homer. The second source, the archaeological finding, we have a rule set for striking arts with no grappling, no wrestling, no groundwork. And in this rule set, in this inscription, the name for this sport is Pankration. So the quote-unquote kickboxing refers to Pankration and not to boxing.
There was a story about an ancient Greek boxer in the Olympics who, in a sudden death overtime, because they did that, used an open hand strike to impale his opponent's abdomen and rip out his guts. And he got disqualified for using an illegal strike.
So what he's referencing here is a story written by the Greco-Roman scholar Pausanias, who lived around 150 CE. Now, the story here is of Cruggus getting impaled by the Moxenos. And this story, of course, is purely fictional because real life isn't anime. You can't stab someone with your fingers and, penetrate the ribs. I'm a bit disappointed that Ramsey Dewey doesn't talk about the ridiculousness of the story itself, given that he's, as far as I know, he's known for sort of debunking myths related to martial arts. And mind you that almost all of the misinformation we have of Pankration comes from this one single source, which is Pausanias, and who is later echoed by other scholars of the Roman era like Philostratos. It's from him we get the story of Arigion and the supposed strangulation of the athlete, and it's also here that we get the story about a certain population of Spartans that would fight with absolutely no rules. So their Pankration had everything from eye gouges and whatnot, and they would fight to the death many times. This, of course, is incredibly ridiculous because the Spartans already had a demographic problem, given that the class of citizens, the Spartiates, were already far less than the serfs, which were the helots. And there were constant wars and so forth. So they needed every young, able male to be able to fight and protect his country and be trained properly. So it makes no sense why they would fight to the death or maim each other just for practice or just for sport. At what age would they do this? Would they do this when they were 15 or 20? At what point would half of their male population be decimated because they wanted to fight in this, brutal sort of way? It's a completely ridiculous fabrication. And the fact that it's echoed by so many academics throughout the decades is quite embarrassing.
So, wrestling, again, different than the modern equivalent. Basically, the only rule was no striking. So you could break fingers, all submissions were allowed.
This is incorrect. In wrestling, there were no submissions and there were no joint manipulations. And the reason we know this is because, firstly, there are mentions in ancient Greek texts where we see that groundwork was an exclusive part of Pankration and no other sport. But also, we know this from the Spartans. It was illegal from Lycurgian law, so from Spartan law, for the Spartans to compete in any sport that had submissions. Hence why we have no listing of any ancient Spartan champion in either boxing or Pankration, because they never competed. However, they did compete in wrestling where submissions were not allowed. It was scored on points.
And you submitted by raising one finger like this. There was a famous wrestler in the ancient Olympics who would break his opponent's fingers first so that they could not signal submission.
Now, about the finger breaking that he mentions, that I didn't go much in depth in the Sensei Seth video. Once again, the only account we have of finger breaking or finger joint manipulation in ancient Hellenic combat sports comes from one author. That, of course, is Pausanias, who I mentioned earlier. And he says that he found a statue of a Pancratias named Sostratos, who was nicknamed Acrochersitis. And acro and chiras could be interpreted as fingers, but chances are this meant shoulder. And this Pancratias was more likely someone who was famed for his shoulder lock, because if it was legal to manipulate fingers, which of course makes no sense given that a form of submission was lifting the index finger, then this tactic would have been used far before Sostratos, who was an Olympic champion in 364, 360, and 356 BCE, so close to 300 years after Pankration was introduced into the Olympics. Now, mind you that after mentioning Sostratos, Pausanias also mentions a wrestler who was named Leondiskos. Now, this Leondiskos was a wrestling champion from 100 years before Sostratos. Now, I have heard from another academic that there is an inscription in Olympia that mentions that finger breaking or finger bending was illegal, which of course would have meant that someone tried it for it to become illegal, but I haven't found this inscription anywhere. He doesn't, of course, mention a source. But yeah, that mention is the only reason why I said that it was debatable. Otherwise, it's not debatable. Also important to note here is that there was tapping to signify submission. It's just that it was impossible for the painters of the time to show a tapping motion in the amphorae.
His opponent's fingers first so that they could not signal submission before he strangled them to death.
I've mentioned this 100 times, but the supposed strangulation of Arigion is completely fictional. But yeah, I go into this in the Sensei Seth video, the human weapon video, and so forth.
Say Pankration in the modern world, a lot of people think of the organization that Boss Rutan fought in, back when they did those open hand strikes.
So what he mentions here is Pankration, which as far as I know is not supposed to be faithful to the ancient Greek Pankration. It was actually a Japanese organization that is said to have been inspired by Pankration, but I don't think that their goal was to make it faithful to Pankration. That being said, out of all modern forms of MMA, the rules of Pankration are closest to Pankration. They still do differ from ancient Pankration significantly, but they are closer than other modern MMA equivalents.
Because when your hand is taped up and gloved up, this is a mechanically superior weapon in every single way to this, in terms of reach, in terms of power, in terms of damage output. With very, very few exceptions.
So what he says here is correct. If your hands are taped or wrapped, especially if you're wearing gloves, then open hand strikes make no sense, because the trade-off of the open hand strike to the closed fist is you lose range, but you protect your hand from injury and cause less superficial damage to your opponent. And with this in mind, note that there are Pankration depictions with open hand strikes with the hands actually wrapped. And the only way to explain this is, as he mentions here, given the Pankration organization, is that there was a rule that mandated that in Pankration, closed fist, bare knuckle strikes to the head were not allowed.
There are a ton of other Pankration organizations using that name, some of which don't even allow strikes at all. Some of them are straight submission grappling tournaments using the name Pankration.
It is notable to mention that when ancient Greek athletes trained in groundwork, many times they would train with wrestlers, and they would end up training both wrestling and groundwork in the skama, which was the sandpit meant for wrestlers. So in that sense, it wouldn't be far-fetched to call a mix of standing grappling and groundwork as Pankration, much like the way that kickboxing was named as a form of Pankration as well.
Generally speaking, almost every Pankration organization in the modern world has way more rules than mixed martial arts.
So what he mentions here is true, and the rules are mostly related to karate. And I go into this again in the human weapon video into more detail, because in that video, we see a lot of the modern Pankration organizations that held competitions in the late 90s, early 2000s. And in that video, I mentioned that most of these quote-unquote Pankration masters that sort of referee or teach these types of competitions were karate practitioners. So they basically just used typical karate rules, added grappling and wrestling, and called it Pankration, which of course is absurd. So, for example, they used a point scoring system, which didn't exist in Pankration. It was illegal to strike to the head, either open or closed hand strikes, much like karate. And they would even award points for the difficulty of the maneuver executed. I mean, overall, it was like a Shoryuken / Kyokushin contest that had grappling mixed into it. So overall, quote-unquote modern Pankration is just a reskin of karate. And when you see them fighting, if you were to remove the tacky, blue and white costume and just see their stance, the way they pull back their offhand to the waist, anyone could recognize it to be karate. And of course, I'm not saying that there's something wrong with karate. The competitions in themselves were interesting in that you had karate mixed with grappling and wrestling. The problem is it has nothing to do with Pankration. And it only made the confusion surrounding Pankration more intense. And in the end, I think it ended up doing more harm to the revival of the sport than it did any good.
Which is kind of a great twist of irony, since the original idea behind Pankration was to allow all skill, all techniques were legal.
As I mentioned before, there were several techniques that were illegal, like headbutts, for example, strikes to the groin, and so forth.
And so it is weird that it's become this strange shadow of its former self, where it is kind of like this safe space MMA, if you will. Yeah, I said it. Modern Pankration is safe space MMA.
So if I understand him correctly, what he's saying is that because modern Pankration has rules, more rules than other MMA, that it's like a safe space MMA. But here's the thing. There is a time and space for a type of all-encompassing combat sport that has more rules and more safety precautions than what is normally found in competitions like, for example, the UFC. That time and place is the Olympics. And this is what I meant when I mentioned that Pankration is the best candidate to become an all-encompassing combat sport that re-enters the Olympics. not only because it has significant cultural ties to the organization, to the event, which is something that a lot of Sensei Seth fans really struggle to comprehend, given the comments that I received on that video. But other than this cultural significance, because Pankration had these rules, these safety precautions that, of course, were meant for other reasons back then. It was more so that they wouldn't have deaths in the Olympics when there was a truce. And again, I go into this in the human weapon video. But these safety precautions will make it appropriate to a larger, wide-scale mainstream audience that also includes, for example, children, because it will be far less brutal than what we see with ground and pound and with closed fist strikes with 4-ounce gloves to the head that lead to cuts and other injuries that we see in the UFC, all of which make MMA unapproachable to certain audiences.
Anyway, that's Pankration.
So anyway, that's not Pankration, but overall, again, I don't feel as insulted, let's say, as the Sensei Said video, because even though Ramsey Dewey does get the majority of the things he mentions here, at least about ancient Pankration, wrong, this video is more of like a Q&A. He's not claiming to be an expert, and it's done in one take. It's not meant for a mainstream audience the way the Sensei Seth video is, where he has quote-unquote experts and a highly edited video, footage of ancient Greek monuments and so forth. But yeah, that's about it. And one last thing before I go is, I know I've been doing a lot of reaction style videos, and if you'd like to support the channel so that I can return to making these documentary style videos that I used to, you can do so by subscribing on Patreon. Until the next video, cheers.